washing off. The soil is then polluting the watercourses. Again, this is back to the Moss Valley. And the ruts there, this picture doesn't do it justice. The ruts there are 2 feet deep, sometimes 3 feet deep, and 2 feet across. And this was in the dry period earlier this year. And it's set like concrete, and the water was washing the soil down off the field, down to the bottom, and then into the AASI stream adjacent. And what we see is a landscape that's ploughed, eroded, biologically dead. There's nothing living in that. There's no fungi, there's no invertebrates, there's no earthworms, there's nothing. And that's then polluting the rivers, the lakes, the seas, and it's silting up estuaries. Huge cost. Huge direct economic costs of desilting those landscapes, but also a massive cost in things like lost fisheries and other pollution problems. And all these years on, we are still doing diddly squat about it. It's absolutely appalling. So the other thing, a term that many of you will have heard, I'm sure, the Anthropocene. Welcome to the Anthropocene. This is a period where scientists have now determined that humanity and not nature is driving global environmental and ecological processes. This is for the first time really on that scale. And there are major implications of this paradigm shift. And there's a question really, what does nature mean to the community that live and work in that landscape? And what does that landscape mean to nature? What are the impacts? I like to recommend a bit of light reading. I know we're coming up not that long. The shops are already advertising Christmas. So you can rush out and buy Global Catastrophes, a very short introduction. I like that one, recommend that to my students. Tells you which way it's going to end and it's not good. Or my little book, Eco History, which when it came out in 2014, I think it was, we got some really nice comments, but we did get some criticism for it being too negative. One reviewer said, we can't possibly share this with younger people and children because it's too pessimistic. Well, the good news is it's got a lot worse since then. My other Christmas read, by the way, is Bleak House, which a colleague used to recommend. We're dealing with broken nature. Human impact on nature causes catastrophic change, and conservation has done some fantastic things, way beyond anything I could have imagined back in the 1970s, 1980s, but it has only had partial success. In other words, it's utterly failed. We are not solving the problem. Biodiversity is still hemorrhaging. All sorts of other problems are kicking in. Even coronavirus may well be in part a result of a broken ecological system at a planetary level. So we need radical new approaches, and we need them urgently. These are some newspaper headlines. Entered, species extinction rates accelerating, and another one, humanity has wiped out 60% of animal populations since 1970. I was contacted by our local BBC radio, and I said, I'm surprised that it's not more than that. I thought it was worse than 60%, but still. The report finds this, and the huge loss is a tragedy in itself, but it also threatens the survival of civilization, say the world's leading scientists. It's all good stuff. And if that wasn't convincing enough that we need to do something, the world is on fire. Now, obviously, the media, the news move on, and when something's no longer news, we kind of forget about it. But Australia is still burning. California is burning again. The Mediterranean countries, Greece, Italy, Spain, France, Portugal, they've all had catastrophic wildfires in recent years. Russia had huge fires the other year. We've had them in the Pennines, and we get them down in Dorset and things like that. And there are reasons why this is happening. One of them is to do with a thing that I call cultural severance. And this is the breaking of the people-nature connection at a local level. People are no longer bonded into nature. Human-nature dependence has shifted from local subsistence, which is how we've been for millennia, and long-standing traditions developed over many centuries have ended, and we get things like displacement and extinction of indigenous peoples across the world as well. And we tend to ignore that and forget about it. And they don't have access to media and a profile effectively. Just look at Brazil, but we'll not go there today. Agri-industry and agri-forestry replace local subsistence, and there are consequences of that. There may be short-term benefits at a simple level, but there are long-term consequences. Another aspect of cultural severance is at an individual level. It's the mental and spiritual connections between people and nature, and they've broken. You know, we're an urban community, and there are huge issues for mental and physical health and well-being, and things like forest bathing are a response to try to rebuild and reconnect, and we need to think about that. So some of the consequences are things like the global wildfires, which are, you know, it's to do with climate change, but it's also cultural severance because these are abandoned landscapes. That means biomass builds up. The Australians are now paying Aboriginal people to actually light burn across the landscape to prevent that exact problem. We also see increasingly catastrophic flooding, and I've been working this last year with the community at Fish Lake in South Yorkshire to deal with some of the horrific experiences that they've had. We have major loss of productive soil. I mean, this is just crazy. If you're coming down from another planet and looking at this, this is madness. The soil is our future. This is what feeds you. And we have soils being eroded and washed away, and associated pollution of seas, oceans, impacts on fisheries, biodiversity, etc. It's absolute madness. And we're told now that we may have 50 years or fewer harvests left in many of the lowland breadbasket areas, mainly the ones that were former organic fens, peat fens. So these are the sort of consequences we get. This was Sheffield in 2007. It happened again 2008. It happened again 2013. It happened again big time last year. It's not going to go away anytime soon. We are an increasingly urban community, and we need to recognize that. And we need to think, how do we make connections for things like rewilding to that urban community? They need to resonate with urban people, and not least because we are, at least at some level, a democracy, and it's the urban community, 95% of our population, who actually pay for the interventions that the concepts, and I recognize this won't appeal to everyone in the rewilding community, but it's a personal point of view. And rewilding needs to involve towns and cities as well as the wider countryside. So what is rewilding? Large-scale conservation to restore and protect natural processes and core wilderness areas, and providing the connectivity between areas to protect or reintroduce apex predators and keystone species. That's great. Think about the claims and the aspirations of rewilding. We want to see habitats expanding, not shrinking, wildlife multiplying, not disappearing, people reconnecting with nature, communities flourishing with new opportunities. They're all given goods. The question is, how on earth do we achieve them, and why are we not doing more to do that? Just to pause for thought for something that we don't always consider. We talk about rewilding and it's exciting, and we're going to do this, going to do that. We need to maybe have a think about what is wild, what is wildness, and what is wilderness. And we often don't stop and think about those issues. We also have a problem to some extent with what I call the Wildwood myth. Now, most ancient woodlands originated in the medieval period, either side of Doomsday, mostly after Doomsday. And I get excited about ancient woodlands and their ecology and heritage, etc. But they originate from enclosure of extensive open wooded commons of the Saxon countryside. Go inside ancient woods, and almost every ancient woodland has evidence of early human settlement activities. Romano-British villas, villages, farmsteads, through to medieval settlements and industrial sites. These are not wildwood. These have had people in them for millennia. So the wildwood and the idea of the primeval, there are all sorts of perceptions and misconceptions. So the primeval European landscape was once believed to be wall-to-wall trees. This is the sort of stuff that Franz Vera got himself into trouble over denying. Some people still haven't forgiven him. Big landscapes, mixing mosaics of extensive open savanna, closed canopy forest, riverine floodlines, and vast wetlands. That is a more realistic image of the primeval. That's what the ancient European and British landscape looked like. So what do we mean and understand by wilderness? Wildness and the wild. Well, many landscapes are wild and they have wildness, but they're not wilderness. And this is very, very important when we're thinking about how we might achieve rewilding. And the problem with the term, and I realize I've lost this discussion hands down, so I now go with rewilding, but rewilding to many people implies going backwards to something. And it implies wild without people. And yet these landscapes are deeply cultural, they're eco-cultural. Wildness itself is human perception, whereas wilderness is an absence of human influences and impacts. So here in North Yorkshire, fantastic landscape at Farndale, but it's not wilderness, even though it has wildness. It's eco-cultural. It represents people interacting with nature over countless centuries. And you can see that by walking through the landscape and you're walking the footsteps of ghosts who used to be there. So we've had multiple meanings emerging about rewilding. And there's a general long-term aim to restore and reinvigorate ecological systems, as we see manifested by biodiversity. When you examine some of the terms, they are already loaded, but we haven't got time to look at that today. There are some shared ideals and aspirations, and some of them are many which are contested, and when they're contested, they are contested very hotly. I thought I'd share this Far Side cartoon with you from a couple of decades ago. Wildlife preserves, is that what we want? So what we have is a spectrum of rewilding approaches, from hard rewilding to soft rewilding. Well, hard rewilding is the purest end of a rewilding spectrum, dominated by ideas of removing, as far as possible, human influence in nature. Now, I have to say, I am slightly biased on this because I am an invasion biologist by training, so this starts to be quite exciting stuff. Many proponents of hard rewilding argue the British landscape should be dominated by woodland, unmanaged woodland, as you see above there. The sad thing with that image is it actually was on an incredibly species-rich site at Sheringham Common, an ancient traditional site in Norfolk, probably one of the most biodiversity patches of landscape I've ever walked through. But there it's going through the natural succession to scrub their woodland. So we can have a bit of hard rewilding if we want, and that may be really exciting in some places. There's a danger when we go back to what's actually a mythical lost golden age. So even Holocene European primeval landscapes had people. Those people were in small numbers, but they still burnt vegetation, hunted and herded wild herbivores, and hunted large carnivores, and they had an impact on the entire ecosystem function. We also need to be aware that many global cultures have mythical lost golden ages, and these never existed. So we do need to be careful what we wish for and how realistic it is. Exciting to bring back the mammoth, but is it realistic and is it relevant when we can't even keep hold of the elephant? We can't provide habitat, an extensive habitat that we need for that. Where on earth would we put these things? What would happen to their cultural inheritance? Because they're intelligent creatures and there is no habitat left for them on the planet. So wouldn't we be better concentrating on the real things that matter at the moment? It was said that a red squirrel might cross Britain from coast to coast without once coming to ground. It was so densely wooded, and this is still repeated on mainstream television series and all sorts of things. In the 1970s, Oliver Rackham and George Peterkin developed concepts of ancient woodlands, which is, a cornerstone of conservation. And many now view ancient woods as vestiges of Wildwood with connections back over thousands of years, which is patently untrue. You've only got to walk through them to see the evidence of the people that lived there and worked there over countless centuries. These are not Wildwoods. And there's the dear old red squirrel hopping from bough to bough. And one reason that is clearly not true is that before drainage was extensive, in Roman times, and then again in medieval times, and then early industrial times, the British landscape was probably more than 50% wetland. Now, some of that's wet woodland, I grant you, but there are areas of wetland and areas of open savanna within that landscape. So a squirrel would have to leap a very, very long way indeed to get from bough to bough and not coming to ground. So some key issues and key questions about hard rewilding. These include things like the roles and influences of non-native and native invasive species, often dominant in free world ecology, what I have labelled as a neoliberal market ecology, survival of the fittest. Rob Mars describes some of the invasive species as ecological thugs. These will do very well in a free world ecology, and it would be exciting to see. It's not what's promised, though. It's not what it says on the tin. So possible roles of large grazing herbivores may be already present, introduced, wild, semi-wild or domesticated, often a linchpin, a key point of rewilding, but they're very, very controversial. Some rewilders think grazing herbivores are the bee's knees. Some rewilders think they are the devil incarnate. So you take your pick. And also going back to my urban community, these are Canada geese flighting in across a sunset, and they're non-native, but to a suburban community who see this as contacting wild nature, it's really exciting, it's evocative. Does it matter to them that they're not native? They probably don't know it, and it probably doesn't matter. We need to think about that. Burrowing away in a riverbank near you, and they are spreading like there's no tomorrow. They've eradicated our native crayfish to a large extent, and we are doing pretty much nothing effectively to stop it. So how does that figure? You know, what do we do? Do we just let it go? Do we accept that as part of a new nature? Or do we think, you know, is there anything we can do? We need to ask about relationships and interactions of rewilded landscapes with local people, and particularly with local landowners. And, you know, we need to make those connections. Who gets to decide what the future of these landscapes is going to be? What about funding? Are we as a community happy to pay what it's going to cost? Because it will cost something to change these things. How do projects embed into local and regional economies? It's actually very important for sustainability and for local people that they do. We need to just turn back the clock slightly and think, where in Britain is wild? This is Mockers Park, fantastic medieval deer park. Is it wild? Well, it has wildness, but it's not a wilderness. Realistically, nowhere is truly wild. Everywhere is affected by massive air pollution, historically acid rain, and today nitrogen deposition. And many areas are modified by people and their grazing animals, and also by extinctions of natives and introduction of non-natives. So there is nowhere that you can take me that isn't affected by some or all of those things. So where are today's wild places? High mountain tops, remote crags, scree slopes, bogs, very close to my heart. Coastal cliff tops often have some really interesting, quite wild areas. Salt marshes and freshwater marshes, though these are often dominated by non-native plants now, affected by grazing. Sand dunes, which again have a lot of naturalness in their ecological system, again dominated by non-native plants like spring beauty or non-native animals like the rabbit. So they're not natural in that sense. Some of the most natural systems are probably coastal and riverine shingle banks and erosion areas. These are often the wild spaces within our landscape. And yet this high woodland, hanging oak wood in the Peak District on a hilltop, the public will probably view that as being wild, but it's not. It's ecocultural. It's a coppice wood enclosed from wooded common, probably about 12 or 1300, and then managed for centuries as coppice. So it's ecocultural. The landscape is affected by long-term residual and persistent pesticides. All areas affected by climate change all areas affected by non-native species and removal of keystone natives. Even the high moors are dominated by invasive Australian mosses, and of course by the non-native but ubiquitous sheep. Okay, there's a lot of positive things already happening. Check out the Rewilding Britain website, for example, some really good stuff. And we're not just talking about projects, we're talking about the way that species in those projects behave. These are conic ponies, a sort of close cousin to the wild European horses of times past, and present at Wicken in Cambridgeshire with the National Trust. Then what was interesting watching them is that they now have a behaviour in their herd which is very close to a wild herd rather than a domesticated group of animals. So you're actually getting a rewilding at almost at an emotional level with the animals themselves. And I think that's really interesting. We have some exemplar fantastic sites like Knepp Castle, although of course it's worth remembering when we're considering how we can roll this out. They now have the biggest population of breeding nightingales, of purple emperor butterflies and all sorts of things in the whole of the south of England. Absolutely mind-blowing. But of course, it is publicly funded. They have special grants through Natural England to deliver this. Are we actually prepared to do that for sites across the country? The other issue with Knepp, of course, is that socioeconomically, it's in a particular area just south of London, orbital, and it doesn't necessarily transfer easily to Lancashire, to South Yorkshire, to North Lincolnshire. So the economic model may need tweaking if we're going to bring these things about elsewhere. Purist arguments turn back to perceived Pleistocene golden ages before human impacts. It's neither possible nor desirable. We have ecocultural landscapes with people a part of nature, not separate from it. And that has been the case for thousands of years. We cannot, and it's not good, to simply remove people from the situation. So soft rewilding, where does that lead us? This is an example I thought was quite pertinent. It's near to where I live. We're doing a project at the moment. This is Grace Park in Sheffield. It's really Norton Park, which we've now documented back to about 1200 as a medieval deer park. It's a huge area. And the late Oliver Gilbert and myself, back in the 1980s, this landscape, this now historic landscape, zoned so that instead of short mown grass, amenity grassland, it's been essentially rewilded. It has a meadow management on parts and no management on other parts. And that's where the biodiversity is, that's where the flowers are, that's where the butterflies are. And really exciting, that's where the people go. They love it. Now that's not hard, we can do that and we can probably save money. One of the issues is to recognise people being part of and within nature. Very, very important. We're not separate from it, we are part of it. We've been part of it for millennia, relying on local landscapes for subsistence, relying on local landscapes for our very survival. And what we have now also is the change in ecological palette. It's been changed radically by gross human impacts over millennia and by natural fluxes too. Nature today is irrevocably different from prehistory, so we couldn't go back even if we wanted to. Human impacts transform soils, waters, landscapes, climates, nutrient levels, fauna and flora. It's not possible to revert to the golden age, but we move forwards to a futurescape, different and distinctive from past ecological systems. And yes, as an invasion biologist, the new futurescape will be made up of things like grey squirrels, Himalayan balsam, and hybrid bluebell, along with the natives. Whether you like it or not, we are going to have a recombinant future ecology. There's no way around it. We are not going to stop those things. They're out of the box. So rewilding to futurescapes is the issue. It's not going back to a lost golden age. And nature is doing it itself. Anyway, this is the River Don near where I live, in the heart of Sheffield, as it was in the late 1800s. Biologically dead, hot water running at 20 degrees, winter and summer, and very stinky, full of sewage, a few dead bodies and the like. biologically dead. And that's it today, with a glorious creative meadow alongside a self-rewilded river. Now have 12 to 14 species of fish back, including salmon spawning in the last couple of years. But of course, it's a recombinant ecology. The woodland flora have recolonized under the Japanese knotweed that you can see in the foreground, and the otters love the Japanese knotweed. It's great cover. So we have a truly recombinant ecology, and it started to rebuild the trophic levels, the predators. Fantastic. This was dead. Even in the 1970s, there was nothing there, and now we have the fish back, and we have the predators back, the grey herons and kingfishers. You can go onto the urban don in the middle of Sheffield and you will see herons, kingfishers, cormorants and the rest. So one of the things I'm interested in is rewilding light. We want a rewilding revolution in Britain and Europe, bottom upwards, to engage a wide and diverse range of stakeholders. Rewilding seen as a radical new approach to ecology and planning from micro to macro, with practical implements, plus a radical revision of human nature paradigms. So the future is rewilding light. Rewilding the body and mind is part of that. A rewilding revolution involves regaining humanity's contact with nature. The umbilical cord joining people and nature has been severed and replaced by utilitarian resource-based attitudes. So society writ big must rediscover its ecological soul. And this involves practical implementation like at NEP, but also it's aspirational and it's emotional and it's psychological. We want to see the restoration of ecological processes, reduce adverse human impacts on ecological systems, present and past, maintain or increase biodiversity, restore ecological functioning to damaged ecosystems. Like at Thorn Moors, this was the biggest lowland peatland in Great Britain, certainly in England, the heart of the Yorkshire, North Lincolnshire fens, and reduced down to about 7 miles by 4 miles and desiccated, drained and cut over for peat. But we're now re-wetting it inch by inch to get the sphagnum carpet growing again to sequestrate carbon to hold back the water. It'll only take 500 years to get it back as a functioning peat bog. We want to recover self-managing functional ecosystems. And this may be by reintroduction or recovery of lost keystone species, re-establishment of core ecological functions, rebuilding trophic levels in dysfunctional systems. I live on the southern edge of Sheffield, inside the ring road, but within 10 minutes walk of open countryside. And I've got friends in that countryside who now have barn owls breeding in their gardens, in their garages. And I've had barn owls displaying over my back garden in suburban Sheffield. That is a rebuilt, functioning trophic system. We need to restore and enhance ecosystem services. There's a lot of talk about carbon sequestration and storage and biodiversity, but we need to add things like water cleansing and quality and storage and management, so we reduce flood risk and we reduce drought. These are big, big issues. And I think rewilding in this sense has got very broad outcomes, and these are less focused than traditional nature conservation targets, which are often specific, measurable communities and species. There's huge potential to return less productive agricultural land to wilder conditions. So unproductive, less productive and perhaps damaged lands can be allowed or encouraged to move towards self-sustaining ecological systems. They will develop richer biodiversity. This is Nocton Fen in east of Lincoln in Lincolnshire. And that was wetland probably 300-400 years ago, a peat fen, and it's now that. It is biologically dead. Again, it's an inert material. There's quite high organic content, and that is breaking down and being released into the atmosphere as carbon dioxide, so greenhouse gas. And downstream, there's no water holding capacity in this. Downstream will get flooded far faster, far bigger, far greater than previously. It's not a good system and it's not sustainable. We also have huge areas of post-industrial land across North Lincolnshire, North Nottinghamshire, South Yorkshire, North Derbyshire, and of course Cheshire and Lancashire. Huge areas of post-industrial sites, which we can turn back to some of the richest biodiversity-rich sites in the landscape. We just need to think how we do it. There's a possibility of reintroduction or conservation of large grazing herbivores, because we aspire to be largely self-determined and self-managed with some of these sites. We would expect to see reduced human directed management over time. But we have to be careful of the assumption that freed systems will return to natural or develop into a new nature, and that new nature will involve a mix of native and non-native species. We look at reintroduction or conservation and protection of lost carnivores at a range of trophic levels. Carnivores are some of the things that we've lost from many systems, for a range of things from straightforward persecution to DDT and other pesticide pollution. So we want to engender ecosystem functionality and restore missing trophic levels, facilitate effective functional ecology through these restorations, and also restore natural checks and balances to what are now dysfunctional ecosystems. So pine martens, there are projects to reintroduce the pine marten to Peak District. I keep telling people it's already there, it never went away. You just need to do something to safeguard it. We've had records of them back to the 1970s in the region. They are still there. And the great thing with pine martens is that they're not a controversial thing. If you think of reintroducing deer, pine martens you can't really argue against, but you get them back. Pine martens, and we've got polecats come back as well, then you may be able to insert checks and balances on the red squirrel, grey squirrel dynamic. Red squirrel may be able to survive in the presence of pine martens. So these things work. Refocused ecological systems. We need to think about contrast with restoration, and the emphasis of rewilding is an emphasis on reordering communities, species and processes to kickstart functioning delivery of ecosystem services. So you're trying to get a system that works. We need to establish socio-ecological systems and processes to trigger the desired changes. We have to reduce human-driven inputs over time on what would be a much bigger palette of sites than we're presently managing, because we don't have the resources to manage these by traditional nature conservation. So we need systems that are sustainable and that are cost effective over large areas. So we need to reconstruct nature to deliver that. And one of the best ways, although not everybody agrees, is obviously through large herbivores, but these need to be managed in an appropriate way. I've seen some dreadful examples of where large grazing herbivores have destroyed what's left of the site. So we need to think very carefully about how we manage these things. The aspirations are to apply key human management interventions to release ecological processes through positive interventions like species introductions or recovery, to restore ecological functions, to allow natural recovery. In my urban river Don and River Sheaf, we have otters back. It's wonderful. And I tell people back in the 1990s, there will be otters back, and people thought are completely barking, which of course I may be. But they've come back by themselves because we've reduced the pollution. And we've also reduced, so DDT, which is a problem, and we've reduced the pollution in the river. So the fish have come back, so the otters have come back, and the otters are squeezing out the mink, and that means ultimately the water voles can come back. So that's how the system should work. And we've reintroduced red kites to various sites up near Leeds, for example, and further south, and they are now recolonising into the Peak District and Derbyshire. And I get excited readers of my newspaper columns saying, oh, we've seen red kites near Barlow in Derbyshire, it's fantastic. And that's a wonderful thing. That is bringing back a degree of wilderness and wildness to local people. And it can be in various forms at various levels, species introductions and reintroductions and recolonisations. Natural recovery will then follow through less predictable trajectories than traditional nature conservation. And we are aiming, in some cases at least, to end up with self-sustaining ecological systems, which clearly is not the case at present. There are implications of the scales of rewilding. Some rewilding projects are enormous, many are very large. But to work, And again, this is where not everybody will agree, but to work, it cannot be restricted to mega sites. For success beyond individual sites, rewilding principles need to be applied widely and at all scales, from micro to macro. This is the Hagwood Meadow project, just south of York, and it's fantastic. It's a created site. It's relatively small and it's relatively new, but it is now incredibly biodiverse, developed from intensive arable of the sort that I showed earlier. So we can do this. We need to think about the differences between conservation and habitat creation. They are different and distinctive. It's possible to enhance existing sites or habitats rather than necessarily start anew. And we can join existing and newly created sites by connections and corridors, and these can be real or virtual. It's an example in the Peak District, where it's a post-industrial site from coal mining in the 1800s, allowed to revert to grassland and now managed in an ad hoc way by grazing herbivores. And it's developing into a young, incipient wood pasture. It is incredibly biodiverse. It's not been planned, it's not been seeded, it's just been allowed to follow its own pathway. And it is, to use a technical term, an absolute cracker. It's a wonderful site. And there are other benefits of in situ conservation. One is that you get local provenance of seed sources and fauna and flora, and historical veracity, that what you're getting back, like my shadow woods, may relate to what was there perhaps 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago. The other thing that we get, which Ted Green always waxes lyrical about, is the invisible biodiversity. The fungi, bacteria, microarthropods, etc., which are essential for a fully functioning ecosystem, but we tend to ignore because we mostly can't see them. So we don't bother with the fungi, which actually make the world go round. So often if we're creating things, we're actually only creating the bits we can see, and we miss out the bits that we can't see. And just because we can't see them doesn't mean they're not important. In situ may also require less intervention or less radical intervention. And we're dealing with process rather than creation. What active interventions can we bring about? Well, we can manipulate soil conditions, drainage, water, things like that. Introduction or removal of grazing animals. Changing grazing or mowing regimes, things like timing and height of cut, etc. And we can use analogue species of lost natives, so longhorn cattle, highland cattle, heck cattle for extinct aurochs, etc. Excitingly, we can reintroduce or introduce lost eco-architect species, the beaver and the wild boar. And they're back already, whether we like it or not. Not everyone agrees with this, but wild boar are back in a wood near you because people are moving them. And DEFRA sat on the fence and said, do what you want as long as the landowner's happy. Is wild boar a lost extinct native to be welcomed back, or is it an invasive alien to be eradicated? But there's no such thing as a natural woodland in Britain without those two species, beaver and wild boar. Conservation of carnivores tends to be quite controversial, but it can happen, as I've already said, at different trophic levels, and at modest levels, which are significant, it's not controversial. Maybe when you get onto the big boys, wolves, brown bears, that's a bit hairy, but lynx could probably come back and be relatively uncontroversial. We can also add habitat supplements, particularly in smaller sites for lost landscape features, veteranization of trees, bird boxes, bat boxes, bug boxes, brash piles, dead wood, pools, ponds, various feeders and other targeted interventions. So small scale habitat creation and manipulation. What options do we have for habitat creation? Well, and we actually have the toolkits for all these. Wilding banner, creation of wildflower meadows and pastures, woodland and scrub like my shadow woods, hedgerows, heath, moor and bog, wetland of various sorts. And these all vary with site size, characteristics and locations. The ecological drivers are significant, but with rewilding, the standard ecological processes occur. So we're dealing with successional change and flux. We need a basic understanding of key factors and strategy theory, and then the process and pathways and outcomes become predictable. And I see a lot of sites where people just not really thought these things through, and in many ways don't actually know what they're doing. So, you know your site, you know the conditions, and you know what your interventions are, and you know hopefully where the trajectory is going to take you. But then with rewilding, you have a diversity of outcomes which are less predictable and less precise. And that's to some extent the excitement, that you're going to let nature run its course. We're actually not very good at doing that. We like to fiddle and interfere all the time. So what are the barriers? Eutrophication. Well, raised nutrient levels. This is a generic problem across the whole of the country through air pollution. And that favours competitive and Catholic species and potential invasions. Site access may limit management interventions. Socioeconomic conditions may limit the approaches that we can use. And site characteristics, ecology, history of management, location, other competing uses, etc., may restrict what can be done effectively. Available finance, very, very important. And hugely significant, this is probably the key point, is willingness and resources of key landowners. And the exciting thing I've had in recent years is approaches from people that own big estates to individual farmers to small owners coming and saying that they don't like what's happening and they want to do something different, and they're prepared to just do it. So we simply need to make the economic model stack up to bring those changes about. There's a willingness to change things which has not been there in the past. Size is important in this situation. So sites can be very small and modest to large-scale ambitious projects. And there are consequences of scale. Small sites need more intensive intervention and habitat creation, gardening, in other words. Large sites harness naturally based processes to generate scrub and new natural woodland and other such features. So again, it's horses for courses. This is Hagwood Meadow with Ros there looking at a pond, and it's an intensively managed site. It's a creator site, it's quite small, but it's delivering fantastic biodiversity, and it's delivering a very, very important social and educational resource for the neighbourhood as well. And it's a model of how we can do things. Are we dealing with conservation or rewilding? Well, rewilding to me is one tool. Rewilding includes nature conservation elements to join up existing conservation projects. And biodiversity of rewilding projects will actually come from existing nature reserves, which again, not all rewilders really seem to understand this. But essentially the nature reserves we have are the time capsules for biodiversity, carrying species and communities through space and time to us today. So from the moors to the shores, from the window box to the mountaintop, conservation bodies and big landowners to private gardens, we may need to rebuild nature brick by brick. It's time for action. We need to put the species back or allow them to arrive back. And we could do it. We could actually change the world if we so wish. Every new development in land use needs to address ecological issues. All developments can easily and cost effectively produce positive impacts on nature, climate mitigation, flood alleviation, and biodiversity extinction. We just need to do it. We need to stop talking about it, and we need to, in Boris's words, get it done. So some final thoughts. We have the toolkits, we have the understanding, the principles of countryside management, which is my background, largely in urban fringe areas, provide the tools for positive planning interventions. And we just need to be more imaginative. I mean, we all subscribe to this. We all see this as we drive up the M6 or the M18 near where I am, or the A1 or the M1. Huge areas of open land going to this sort of landscape. And it's inexcusable. That is giving nothing back at all. It wouldn't cost nature conservation or the government anything to have that generating solar powered electricity, to have that having water retention systems, to have that having a green roof, to having supplements like bug boxes, bat boxes, bird boxes, etc., on a vast scale. And you suddenly start to have a massive, massive impact. The cost to the businesses like that is negligible. So why are we not doing it? Why are we allowing these things to happen? And it's because of developments like this that Fish Lake and other communities were underwater this last winter. This does not make any sense at all. And this is part of what I would see as a rewilding agenda right abroad. We need to bring back the joy, if you like, the joy of nature, sky dancing buzzards from over my back garden the other day out into the Peak District moors or the Festival Bowland or wherever. We need to encourage people to enjoy, to be inspired by hearing the rutting red deer stags, as they will be doing in a couple of weeks. This is wonderful. When people first come across these on the edge of the urban area where I live, they are blown away by it. That is contact with nature. Or seeing kingfishers battling for territory on an urban river such as this. This inspires people, this reconnects people. Or simply taking pause to sit and gaze at a landscape and think about our place in the universe, our contact with nature, which we often don't do. We're too busy rushing around. So, just to close, for the Forest of Bowland, fantastic landscape. It means a lot to me because I was at Lancaster University. I was saying to Robin earlier, our college bar was the Trough of Bowland College. And across the Forest of Bowland, from the window box to the high moors, it's time for action. Thank you very much for listening.